I'm Cathy Beaton, I'm the Principal Housing Strategy Officer, and I work within the Planning and Housing Strategy team at Lancaster City Council. Before we go into the main body of the presentation, it's probably just worth focusing on what is the role of the home strategy. And it's really about local authorities having an understanding of the housing market and the housing needs in their district. Next slide, please, David. Typically, a housing strategy would cover a 5-year period, and that's what ours is doing. Next slide, please, David. A term that you'll hear throughout the conference today is affordable housing. So I think it's really helpful to just break that down a little bit. So what do we mean by affordable housing? We're talking about social housing, which is owned and managed by local authorities and registered providers with slightly different regulatory frameworks. And certainly for local authorities, we have additional statutory duties that fall upon us. And an example of that is we have a statutory duty around homelessness. The other main form of affordable housing is intermediate housing, and that's aimed at households who are unlikely to qualify for social housing, but who are unable to buy or rent market housing. So in terms of what the local position is there, typically shared ownership is the most commonly seen form of intermediate housing, but it does vary from district to district. So what are the key challenges in Lancaster District? I think it's very, very fair to say that affordability is a key challenge. You know, when you do an analysis of average house prices in Lancaster, you know, typically you're seeing that would be 6 times the equivalent of a single income household. So some real challenges there. For a lot of our households, market rents are unaffordable. In terms of the tenure mix of Lancaster District, only 10% of the total housing stock in the district is social and affordable housing. And when you compare that, the national average is 17%. So our position is considerably lower than the national average. Looking at the social housing supply, there's a mix match between supply and demand. So if you do an analysis of the social housing stock, there's a pretty even mix of 1, 2 and 3 bedroom accommodation when you take account of council stock and RP stock. And when I say RP, I'm talking about registered providers, also known as housing associations. And if you do an analysis of the council's housing register, what you'll see is that at any one year, probably at least 50%, if not more, of the housing register are waiting for 1 bedroom accommodation. That does take into account older people as well. So there are some clear issues there around what is the supply and what is the demand. Now, unfortunately, I haven't got time to look at that in real detail today, but for anybody that hasn't looked within the draft document, please do so, because you'll see that clearly evidenced within the section 4 of the document, which is the market analysis. Next slide, please, David. Okay, so what was the leading to us producing this new strategy? The last strategy was produced in 2012 and that expired in 2017. Before we started to prepare a new strategy, as part of the local plan preparation, the council commissioned a new housing needs study. That was commissioned in 2018 and we used ARC4 to undertake that work. The study estimated that there are 6,000 households in need of affordable housing in Lancaster District, and leading to that, there would be a continuing need for social and intermediate housing. The study also concluded that our population will increase by 6% by 2033, particularly in the over 65s. So the study was basically suggesting that we need to think about increasing the housing choices of older people. The study also recommended that in terms of housing being developed, new housing of all tenures should contain a wide mix of housing types and sizes. And that was very much about the under occupation that occurs across all sectors. Next slide, please, David. Okay, so the next two sort of key events that informed the strategy were in 2019. So as we know, the council declared its climate emergency, and that was in January 2019. And then later on in the year, there was a change within the City Council's administration. And as you know, we now have Councillor Caroline Jackson as the Cabinet Member for Housing. One of Caroline's very early actions was to set up a housing strategy member working group. And that was working with staff across different housing services within the City Council to basically develop the new strategy. And there were very obvious key drivers within that process. So we had to think about the climate change agenda, and what can we do to contribute to climate change, review the local need within the district, think about the council's role as an existing social landlord, what opportunities were there in terms of the council's land, and how were we going to access funding. Next slide, please, David. So touching on climate change, as I said, the council declared its climate emergency in January 2019. One of the very early actions that we've done is set up a local plan action review group. And that really is to review the position that we've adopted within the current local plan. When our current local plan was adopted, we set new standards around space and accessibility. So all new housing should now comply with nationally described space standards, and 20% of new housing should be built to accessibility standards. That doesn't go far enough in terms of climate change. So what we're looking to do within the review is to meet our ambition that we want to try and achieve low or zero carbon homes, and also take steps to improve the existing housing stock. Notwithstanding that piece of work, because within the local plan, that would be a generic standard that would apply to anybody building housing. There's nothing to stop the City Council setting its own standards, and that's exactly what we're doing within the home strategy. So in terms of schemes that the council are looking to develop, if they are new build, then clearly our ambition is to make them zero carbon. But we've also set some standards around our existing housing and any of the projects that we've identified. Okay, David, next slide, thanks. So moving on to the housing and regeneration priorities that we've identified in the strategy, there are 6 in total. The Canal Quarter, regeneration of Morken, Mainway, Ridge Square, extra care housing for older people, and Mellishore Caravan Park. Next slide, please, David. So in terms of the Canal Quarter, as you can see, hopefully you can see the boundary of the Canal Quarter. So at the top end, the boundary is St Leonard's Gate and Edward Street, and at the bottom end we're stretching across to the car park on Nelson Street. So that's basically the boundary of the Canal Quarter. 60% of the land within the boundary is owned by the City Council in the form of surface car parks. In years gone by, it was always envisaged that that area would provide a regeneration scheme that was predicated on retail. This scheme is a move away from those previous proposals, and we're talking about a mixed-use development. And for the first time, we are expecting to see some housing delivery within those plans. Potentially, we could see a mix of tenures. Nothing is certain around how much housing we can achieve, but as I say, that is a key priority of the City Council. Where we've got to with the Canal Quarter so far is the council has produced a strategic regeneration framework. We did that in 2019, and early in 2020 we did some community engagement. That document is really there to set some principles around the standards and the scope of the scheme, bearing in mind that the council only owns 60%. So we have 40% land interests belonging to other parties. And clearly we need a mechanism to embed some of the principles that we're looking to achieve there. The work will continue this year. So the next stage of our plan is to do the detailed master planning, and that's where we will really thrash out the options for the Canal Quarter and then undertake further consultation. Our ultimate aim is that this is a council-led approach, and of course what we want to try and achieve here is an exemplar scheme. Next slide please, David. So the next priority is Morken. That's been a historic regeneration priority of the City Council. Much of the objectives and targets that were set within the West End Master Plan have actually pretty much been met. But what we see is that it is still an area of considerable housing need. That was borne out by the housing needs study. It typically has lower levels of social housing than other parts of the district, and there is no existing social housing stock within the West End that belongs to the City Council. What we see is that it functions differently in terms of the amount and number of private sector landlords. So that is a big challenge in terms of housing quality and housing cost. There are two lower super output areas within the West End area. We know that food and fuel poverty are considerable challenges. In the not too distant past, the council has investigated selective licensing, and that was a tool to try and address some of the issues with private sector landlords. At the time, although we did extensive consultation, a decision was made not to implement a licensing scheme. However, you will see from the home strategy that there is an intention to review that position. So later on in the year, we'll be seeking authority from Cabinet to undertake further consultation. And as I say, that's about giving us another tool to deal with some of the issues within the West End. So I mentioned the West End Master Plan earlier. Much of the objectives was around diversifying the tenure offer in the West End. We feel there's room for more, and potentially there's a role for the City Council. We are very close to setting up a housing company, which will be wholly owned by the City Council. You'll see the term Housing LATCO on the slide, and we're using that as a vehicle to generate funding to take some of our schemes forward. Through the LATCO, initially, it isn't a vehicle to deliver social housing, and I won't get into too much technical jargon around that, but we are using it as a tool to provide what we consider to be affordable private rented sector accommodation. And hopefully it will increase the housing options to people that want to live and work in the West End area. Obviously, we have to start on a fairly small scale. For now, we pitched that at a pilot scheme of 10 properties. So we'll be looking to acquire 10 properties in the West End in the next financial year. We want to try and grow that portfolio, but clearly what we'll do after the first 10 is review the effectiveness. Bearing in mind that the council is borrowing, we are not getting any external subsidy here. So we do need to keep an eye on the budget position. Next slide, please, David. So the next priority is the regeneration of Mainway Estate. Mainway Estate is in North Lancaster and could be described as not being typical of the rest of the council housing stock. It was built in the 1960s. It's wimpy, no fines concrete construction. There's just over 250 properties. They are predominantly different forms of 2-bedroom flats and masonettes. The properties are structurally sound, but the external cladding is failing. What we're seeing is that there's moisture penetration getting into the properties, they're expensive to heat, there's issues around the client group and suitability of those properties, bearing in mind that with welfare reform and the bedroom tax, there's limited scope for the City Council to under-occupy its stock. So we're talking about families living in those properties. I think it's fair to say that the estate lacks community cohesion in its current form, and we do see issues around antisocial behaviour. So back in July last year, we took a report to Cabinet to seek authority to consult the tenants of residence. We commenced that consultation in August. The work is still ongoing, but ultimately we want to explore a comprehensive regeneration scheme for Mainway. So I'm not going to say any more about Mainway because I know Caroline's going to say in her roundup session in the plenary session. So I'll leave it at there for now. Next slide, please, David. This is just a quick shot of Mainway for anybody that doesn't know the area. You can see in the background, we've got an 11-storey tower block. The rest of the buildings on the right-hand side are all 3-storey, 2-bedroom flats. On the other side of the road, it's a mixture of masonettes and similar flat blocks. So if you don't know Mainway, that's what it looks like. Next slide, please, David. Okay, the next priority is Ridge Square, which is on the Ridge Estate in Lancaster. It's a little mixed tenure scheme which combines two retail, a general store and a fish and chip shop. We have a community centre there and we have housing. Most of the housing is council owned. There are some properties that have been sold under the right to buy, but it's fair to say that those properties are poor in terms of layout and access. Ridge Square over the years has been a magnet for antisocial behaviour. So we've identified it as a priority with the intention of doing some consultation and investigating any options that we could take forward. So in many ways, this is a more medium-term priority, but it's there and it's been identified. Next slide, please, David. The next key priority is the provision of extra care housing. So this has been a joint objective of the City and County Council pretty much since 2013. You'll remember me mentioning that the housing needs study has suggested that we need to look at the ageing population and think about the choices available to older people. I think it's fair to say that within the existing social housing provision, there is quite a good deal of choice for older people. There's lots of different providers, and the City Council is actually the biggest landlord, social landlord for older people. However, there's a gap there, and we need to try and fill that gap. So for anybody that has never heard of the term extra care housing, extra care housing is self-contained properties. I know that says units and I hate that term, but it's generally in the form of apartments with an on-site care team, and typically they're provided in a community hub type setting where you would expect to see other services within that building or very close by. The underlying issue here is that there are far too many admissions into residential care year on year within Lancashire. Obviously that has caused the County Council's considerable issue, but importantly, what we want to be able to do here is catch people before they're forced into residential care. So ultimately, we want to enable older people to remain in an independent setting for longer, and that's what they want too. We have two potential opportunities to deliver schemes in Lancaster. The City Council is looking to deliver a scheme on a site in North Lancaster. We don't own the site, so we're in the process of trying to acquire the site. And a partner organisation called Progress Housing Group are currently taking a proposal forward in South Lancaster. So if both of those schemes come into fruition, we will be, we will be well on our way to meeting that gap within the housing offer for older people. Next slide, please, David. And the final priority that we've identified is Mellishore Caravan Park. That's an existing site of 19 traveller pitches on Mellishore Lane. Previously, it was in the ownership of the County Council, but for many years been managed by the City Council. In 2019, the County Council declared the site as surplus. We saw the potential for those existing residents to be in a pretty vulnerable position with the prospect of the county disposing of the site. So the council took the decision that we would take over the ownership of the site. So it's now owned by the City Council, fully acknowledging that the site is in need of major reinvestment. So at the time the council took that decision, we also basically built in the budget provision to undertake a capital programme over a 4-year period. So that's all agreed and described in the home strategy. Next slide, please, David. You will see within the home strategy document that retrofitting is mentioned in several parts. Clearly, whilst we have set our ambitions around new build housing, we can't forget about the existing housing. And, ultimately, we have set ourselves targets for our own stock. We want to try and get our council housing stock up to EPCC by 2030. Unfortunately, that doesn't mean that those properties are going to be zero carbon. That's a minimum standard that we're setting ourselves. However, incrementally, we will be working to try and improve those standards. And we will also be taking advantage of any government grant that allows us to do that. So we've set the same standards in terms of properties that the LATCO will acquire. Our ultimate intention is when we buy those properties in Morken, we will be retrofitting them up to a minimum of EPCC. If we can get them beyond that, fantastic. And we will be ultimately looking to draw down funding to get them beyond that going forward. So in terms of government funding, the government in the summer launched the Green Homes Grant Scheme. And one of the strands of funding is for local authorities to bid. So I'm not going to say too much on this because I know it's going to be discussed in the workshop on climate change, but just so you're aware, Lancaster has bid with a consortia of other authorities in Lancashire for the funding in round 1. We haven't been notified of whether we've been successful, and we're gearing up to put a bid in for the next round of funding. In terms of increasing our own capacity, what we'd like to do is train our existing repairs and maintenance staff to become trained installers of measures. We've recently created an energy officer post within the City Council. That's been filled by a colleague called Flo Henriksson. And Flo will be working with existing council tenants around maximising their incomes, working with them on their energy bills and supporting them so that if we get an opportunity to install measures in properties, that she will support them through that process. The other thing that we're doing is creating a retrofit advisor post within the Home Improvement Agency. The Home Improvement Agency undertake a wide range of functions working with vulnerable people, primarily around aids and adaptations. We offer a handy person service. So the sort of the missing link is doing the assessments and getting some energy measures in. So hopefully we can plug that gap. Next slide, please, David. So just touching on how are we going to deliver all of this? As I said earlier, with schemes like the Canal Quarter, clearly we have an opportunity, because if we're using our own land, we can control what happens to it. We are going to, as far as we possibly can, explore borrowing opportunities within the housing revenue account, which is where all the council house rents sit. The borrowing cap was abolished by Theresa May in 2017. So there are some freedoms there. Obviously, you know, we have to be prudent, but we can look to borrow money to deliver on our objectives. And as I said earlier, we're setting up the Housing LATCO. That allows us to set up a vehicle with the council being able to borrow through the general fund and on lend to the LATCO. Again, obviously, we have to be prudent. And as I said earlier, schemes have got to be self-financing and pay for themselves. That said, wherever we can, we will look to draw down Homes England grants. Not all of the schemes that we've discussed are eligible for Homes England grant, but obviously we will do everything we can to draw down external funding, and, you know, look out for any other opportunities that may present themselves in the future. Next slide, please, David. So now turning to the biggest section of the strategy, which is all about the needs of specific groups. And I'm just going to whiz through this. We haven't got time to go through everything in detail, but I couldn't possibly not mention homeless households. And what I would draw your attention to is the fact that the council adopted its homelessness strategy in 2020. But much of the work that was done at that time was done before COVID. So what the home strategy attempts to do is actually bring us up to speed with everything that's happened around homelessness through the pandemic. So, you know, we had the Everyone In campaign, which has allowed us to work collaboratively with lots of different organisations and bring all our rough sleepers indoors. And we are continuing to maintain that position. In terms of where the homelessness strategy links directly to the home strategy, a key objective is for us to try and improve access to settled housing for people that experience homelessness, or whether they're in supported housing and they need to move on to something longer term. So that's a key priority. We have identified the need to increase some of the temporary accommodation and more sort of specialist complex needs solutions for homeless households, although it has to be recognised that we have got more commission services than a lot of other of our neighbouring districts. So we are fortunate there, but there are some gaps. We want to be able to improve access to the private sector, and clearly we've talked about how we might be able to do that. And we also want to make use of the government grants. The government has pledged 4 years commitment within the Next Steps accommodation programme. We were eligible for funding in September. That is helping us to maintain our position, and we'll be looking to bid in future programmes. Next slide, please, David. Okay, so the other specific groups that get a mention in the home strategy, and we go into a bit of detail, are all on the next slide. Some of the groups that are identified, obviously with older people, we've already talked in detail about that. It's really just a position statement on where, what the provision is, and where we think we need to be going forward. Next slide, please, David. And I think the four sort of main, the most significant needs that we need to address, we'd have to start with young people and looked after children. At the time we produced the home strategy, Lancashire County Council were just about to start a re-tendering exercise of their young people services. So unfortunately, it wasn't the time to try and describe in detail what the future pathway needs to be for young people. So we have described some of the issues in the home strategy, but what we've done is given a commitment to continue to work with commissioning leads at the County Council to develop a more detailed action plan and something that's a bit more measurable. But we have had discussions, and there are some new service models that we do want to explore with the county. In terms of ex-offenders, before the pandemic, we'd started having discussions with HMP Lancaster Farms to try and improve the pathways of people leaving prison that have got a connection to Lancaster District. And we talked about a pilot scheme that would involve the City Council and a partner organisation called Calico, and trying to link supported housing and a training opportunity for people leaving prison, and try and make things more joined up than they are now. So we're still very committed to looking at that pilot scheme, but as I say, COVID has just got in the way with that. Older people have already sort of set out the position that the most acute need is to bring forward extra care housing. And then finally, people with learning disabilities, physical disabilities, autism and/or mental health. We work very closely with Lancashire County Council to develop more supported living apartments in Lancaster District. A number of opportunities are presenting themselves, but the starting position for this group is most of them live in group homes because that's all there is available. And certainly for the younger adults coming through the system, that they want the choice. They're no different to any other group. So we need to improve the offer to that group and look at more independent settings for them. So we've basically measured that within the home strategy that we want to try and develop 50 supported living apartments in the next 5 years. Next slide, please, David. Okay, so just to sum everything up then, the key messages really are that there is a significant need to increase the supply of social and affordable housing in Lancaster District. We see the council as being a key player in that delivery. Having said that, we still need to work very closely with registered providers. Their role is also critical. And when you reflect on the fact that since 2012, we've had 760 affordable housing completions delivered exclusively through RPs, their role is critical to this. We also want to explore opportunities for more community-led housing in Lancaster District. We're currently working with 2 groups who are delivering exemplar schemes in Halton. We benefited from some central government funding in 2017, and we've used that funding to support those 2 groups. And, you know, we want to continue that work. We want to maximise the opportunities to improve the existing housing and improve quality and choice in the private sector. And we want to use the tools available to ensure that homes meet future needs and help the district to become carbon neutral. Next slide, please, David. Just a reminder that in terms of the home strategy consultation, the consultation runs to the 1st of February. If you don't get an opportunity to share any of your views at the event today, please do get in touch with us. We will be circulating the presentation slides. You can see on this final slide are all my contact details. And as I say, do get in touch with us. And that's pretty much the end of the presentation for this morning.